Hello, everyone, and welcome back. The reason that you cannot see me is because this talk, these PowerPoint slides in this lecture, has a lot of images, and therefore it's a pretty big file size. And I was trying to record this with the video on, and it doesn't want to do it because it makes it such a big file. And so I turned my video off, and also that way you can kind of see the images that are a part of this, which are much more important than you seeing my head. So yeah, so today's talk is about, as I say here, visualizing global poverty. In many ways, this is a conversation about globalization. When we talk about globalization, many times we think of sort of goods and services moving across borders. We think of quote unquote the world becoming smaller, that a lot of people like to say. You and I think of, Amazon becoming ubiquitous, or Walmart, or Coca-Cola, those kinds of things. But what I want to talk about is really some of the downsides of globalization and the impact that extreme wealth has had, that we've seen from the concentration of wealth and power and opportunity and things like that. There are certain groups in America that like to say that um, they want, equality of opportunity, not equality of outcome, and that many individuals in academia, such as myself, want equality of outcome. Well, we don't. I don't. I don't know anybody that does. And the truth is, those statements mask the fact that there is not equality of opportunity. That where you are born is really a genetic lottery, and being born in one place means that you have opportunity to advance, to make money, to be healthy. And being born in another place means that you do not have the opportunity to live, that you are going to be exposed to more diseases, that you are going to be exposed to greater hardship, those kinds of things. And so when we talk about some of these things, it gets almost confusing because it's so big. It's such a massive thing when we talk about 7 billion people in the world. You and I can't picture that in our minds, to say 7 billion people. Or when we say that, 1.4 billion people make $1 a day or less. Like it's hard to conceptualize that. And so what I want to do today is to walk through some of these images, maps in particular, but also images and other things that will kind of help this come to a scale, bring this down to how you and I can think of it. Okay? So many of you might have seen some of these on the internet. They've gotten more popular since I started doing this lecture, which is not to say they got popular because of my lecture, but since I started talking about some of this, it's become a more popular thing to talk about it, and to show these things. So you might have seen these on social media and stuff like that. Some of them probably not, but this is the world you know it, as you know it. This is the world where the image of the map represents geographic size. That the United States is, bigger than, France, and those kinds of things. So this is how you can think of the world, right? This is where we're familiar with, right? But what if we change the size? What if the size on the map wasn't about how many square miles you have, but was based on something else? For example, what if wealth represented your size on the map? Okay. In case you forgot, that light purple area on the left of the screen is the United States. You can see Florida like a chubby little tick sticking out there, right? And suddenly you start to realize that there is a great concentration of wealth. That very skinny, red and rose colored appendage sticking down there in the middle of your map, that is Africa. And I'd remind you that the continent of Africa is um, so large that you can put the United States, all of Europe, all of Canada, all of Brazil, all of Mexico, and several other countries inside of it, right? This image shows you why we often don't talk about the West versus the non-West. What we talk about is the global North and the global South, because there's a tremendous concentration of wealth in northern latitude, sort of north of the equator, right? Um, so one thing that I want to point out here too is I'd like you to notice India, which is the yellow country to the west of China. China is green in this, Japan is purple. But look at India there for a second as we switch over and say, well, what if size on the map wasn't wealth, but what if it was poverty? Now, in case you didn't notice, India grew when we said wealth, and it grew when we said poverty. Well, how can that be, right? How can it be bigger than its geographic size with both poverty and with wealth? Well, that's because India has an extreme imbalance of wealth. They have incredible wealth inequality. India has more millionaires and billionaires than any other country, but they also have more people living on $1 a day or less than any other country. And so there's a real lack of a middle class in India, right? And so that's why that kind of grows in both. You can see Africa here in the middle of your screen, sort of oddly misshapen. But that's because, again, of the incredible inequality here. Now, you might want to ask the question, as anthropologists do, okay, why? What is at the root of this? We don't just want to know that there is poverty. Why is there poverty? Why is there extreme wealth? Why is there inequality? What cultural factors are driving this? To be honest with you, one of the biggest is actually colonialism. Now, there are still lots of colonies in Africa, but even the countries in Africa, again, a pet peeve of mine is when people say, they refer to, certain countries. They'll talk about India, China, Africa. Africa is not a country. Africa is a continent, and it is dozens and dozens of countries. There are more than 1,000 indigenous languages spoken in Africa. There are radically different cultures. The people in Eswatini that I lived with are nothing like the people in Zambia that I lived with, right? Who are nothing like, South Africans that I am friends with, or, those kinds of things, or Egyptians that I have known, right? So it's a vast continent with very different cultures. So I do not mean to speak of it as a singular thing, but in this case, it is productive to do so. Um, Africa was a highly colonized area by European powers starting in, the 1500s and onward. Even before that, you could argue because of things like Alexander the Great, or Romans that were conquering in Egypt and those kinds of things. But the impact of colonialism is not something that goes away when the colonists leave or the colonizers leave. It is not something that stops. So, for example, in Eswatini, where I lived, the British pulled out of the country in 1961, if memory serves me, and left. But the impact of it is something that it doesn't go away, because the point of colonizing an area is to make money off of it. So you are going to extract as many resources as you can while spending as little money as possible. And so for decades or centuries in many cases, that European powers were, owning these regions as colonies. They do no infrastructure building. They don't build roads. They don't build bridges or schools or hospitals. They don't have electrification programs or things like that. And at the same time, they're just looting the country for gold and diamonds and timber and everything else that they possibly can, including people in the form of slavery, right? So many of these countries are, as I said, decades or centuries behind European countries or the United States in terms of infrastructural development, in terms of educating the population and things like that, because that was by design. It's not something that just accidentally happened, right? Likewise, many of these countries are countries that did not exist prior to Europeans drawing lines on a map. And so these countries are further sort of disenfranchised and hurt by the fact that, these two or three or four or five groups that were never considered themselves the same are now forced to be a country. And sometimes these groups were actually at war with each other for many centuries or millennia. They didn't live with each other, they didn't coexist with each other. And now, all of a sudden, after centuries and centuries of fighting and warring, we're supposed to be the same people. We're supposed to be one thing. We're supposed to be countrymen who are working with one another in the government and things like that. And so, in many cases, this is a highly dysfunctional system because it was created by outsiders. At certain times, that was actually intentional. So, one thing that you guys are maybe familiar with is Rwanda and the genocide in 1994 with the Hutu and the Tutsis. The Hutu and the Tutsis were separate groups, but they were two groups that lived together for a very long time. They intermarried constantly. It was extremely common for Hutus and Tutsis to get married and stuff like that. But when they were colonized by European powers, many European powers realized that the best way to colonize somebody was to turn one group against the other. Because in many cases, it's not like, England or France or the Dutch or the Germans or whoever had a lot of people in the country, right? There wasn't a lot of folks there. And so they needed to subjugate the people, they needed to control the population. And an easy way to do that was to say, okay, I'm going to take group A, I'm going to give them more land, more money, more educational opportunity for their children, better jobs. But I'm going to take group B and make them sort of the weaker group with less money, less land, less opportunity, fewer jobs. And I'm going to tell group A, like, hey, make sure you keep an eye on group B, or they're going to take what you have in terms of your land and your money and those kinds of things, and your position, your power, your prestige. And now I don't have to subjugate group B. Group A is going to do it for me. And I don't really need to subjugate group A that much because they're too busy worried that group B is going to sort of step up against them, right? Even though both of them are fighting for the scraps off of my table, I'm giving more scraps to group A, if that makes sense, right? And that's actually what happened with the Hutu and the Tutsis. They were, as I said, they intermarried all the time. They, shared a tremendous amount of cultural features, this kind of stuff. It was the difference between somebody from, Tampa and somebody from Orlando, right? Yeah, you're a different group, but it's not like you're really, really different, right? And so they were able to kind of create this division. A wonderful book that talks about that is the book by Trevor Noah, his autobiography, Born a Crime, and he discusses the ways in which in South Africa that they sort of pitted one group against another to fight over very limited resources that were left to them. And that after apartheid ended and Nelson Mandela was freed and he became president and this kind of stuff, those old animosities that were built by colonial powers, by European powers, were still kind of hanging out, right? That after decades and decades and decades of infighting and distrust and fear and worry and all these kinds of things, it didn't just go away because the white people left, right? And so many times the poverty that you're seeing on this map and that you're seeing around the globe is because of these leftovers. The same can be said of India, as I was discussing about how they grew with wealth and poverty, right? England took some groups and said, all right, you're in charge of this and you're going to get paid for this, but make sure those other people don't try to take that from you. And if those other people step up, you're going to lose what little you have, right? So it was a powerful way of doing that, right? I'll also point out, I'm sure you've been looking at this and sort of figuring out what's where. Again, the United States is that light purple sandwiched between two dark blues on the left of your screen, right? We have poverty in the U.S., and I'm going to talk about it at the end of this lecture, but not like the rest of the world, right? But that's not to say that poverty in the U.S. isn't bad. That's something that a lot of people go, oh, well, you have a refrigerator and you have a roof over your head. People in Africa or people in India or people in wherever don't even have that. That doesn't mean that you're not facing hardship, and it really bothers me, particularly because you talk about the United States versus somewhere like Eswatini that I lived, or somewhere like South Africa or Zambia, or somewhere like that, and it's like, well, Eswatini's literally the size of New Jersey, and their gross domestic product is smaller than the state of Florida, and so yes, poverty in the United States is rarely as bad as it is in that country, But at the same time, the resources that we have are vast compared to that country. And so what you're really saying is we have the opportunity to do something about this in a way that other countries don't, but we won't. And then we'll point at those countries that lack our opportunity and say it's not so bad. So that's a real, irritation for me, right? So what if AIDS and HIV were the size of the map, right? Again, you can see Africa here and the vast size of it. Um, and one of the things that I'm going to routinely point out here is the broad reaching impacts of this. Again, as anthropologists, we look at things holistically, we look at things broadly, we want to understand their interconnection between stuff. Some of the issues here with HIV and AIDS is even bigger than just death, which obviously is an incredibly tragic thing um, for to lose people to this disease. But when we lose people, it's not just that we lose people. There's a connection between this map and the last one. So, for example, looking at Africa here, obviously a continent that's been devastated by this disease. The very southern end of Africa there, in the sort of pink color, is South Africa. And there are two darker circles within the country. One is Lesotho, which is completely surrounded by South Africa on the left, and on the right, that circle, almost on the edge of Africa, that's Eswatini, where I lived and worked. It is mostly surrounded by South Africa, but it does share a little bit of a border there with Malawi. And I wanted to talk about the impact of HIV/AIDS in the country. I may have mentioned this before. Eswatini actually has the highest rate of HIV/AIDS in the world. Officially, 35% of the population is infected. Unofficially, we know that it's a little bit better than 40%. Those two numbers differ for a number of reasons. One of which is that testing really happens in the cities. There's only a couple of big-ish cities in Swaziland or Eswatini. And the testing happens there, but we know that the in the rural countryside the rate of HIV is higher, but the testing is lower. And so realistically, it's going to be higher than the official count because there's lots and lots of people that simply aren't getting tested, right? So let's talk about why this is such a problem beyond the obvious that people are dying. When I lived and worked in Eswatini, I was doing interviews with people about the kinds of foods that they ate, the kinds of wild plants that they gathered, where their food came from, how much food they had, these kinds of things. And over and over again, when I would go to people's homes, um, I would gather demographic data. And so it's like, okay, tell me everybody that lives in your home here. And they have very big families. Plural marriage is quite common there. Men often have more than one wife. Particularly older men, previous generation, our grandparents' generation, that kind of thing. It was real common for men to have more than one wife. And so they had big families, and so I wanted to know, who lives here, how old is everybody, how many kids are there, that kind of thing, to understand how much food they had and what they were eating and that kind of stuff. And over and over again, when I would go into these people's homes, I would meet, a husband and wife that were in their 70s or even 80s, and then the next youngest person would be 10 years old, maybe 12 years old, those kinds of things. And so it was grandparents and lots of grandkids, and there might be 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, 12 grandkids there. And it took me a little while to realize the reason that I was seeing this was that there was a generation that was dead, that they had been killed by this disease. And so you had grandparents that were taking care of their grandchildren. The consequence of this is that you really wiped out the productive generation, because when you talk about farming or manufacturing, agriculture, whatever it is, 80-year-olds are not going to be productive and 8-year-olds are not going to be productive, right? It's that middle generation, the quote unquote parents, really, in this situation, that are going to be productive. The grandparents and the grandchildren are too old or too young. And so this is part of the reason that in that last map you saw so much poverty as well, is that this disease has wiped out a generation. And so, fields and factories and everything else aren't going to be utilized by these groups. This also causes a tremendous amount of starvation. what I found was those households where I was finding grandparents and grandchildren were also the households that um, didn't have very much food. They were reliant on gathering wild plants to feed themselves in many, many cases, or they were reliant on either the government or international bodies like the UN to supply them with aid. Okay. Or else they'd starve because you're talking about 80-year-olds that are supposed to take care of 12 kids, right? They're not going to be capable of doing that, right? So really tragic circumstances. It was very, very hard field work for me. The couple months that I spent in East Swatini were very, very hard because I was faced with so much poverty. I was facing so much starvation. I interviewed people in homes when I did what's called a dietary recall, where to understand what people are eating, you say, okay, tell me everything that you've eaten in the last 24 hours. And what I started finding was people, at first I was confused because they were like, well, I don't know, I don't know. And I'm like, how do they not know anything? I was like, well, tell me anything that you've eaten in the last 24 hours. And what I realized was it's not that they couldn't remember, they hadn't eaten in the last 24 hours. And so there was nothing to recall. While I was in Eswatini, there was a really bad drought, and people literally starved to death. And people who are starving to death don't look like you think they do. They're not laying in the dirt with flies on them or something like that, like you may have seen in Hollywood movies. What they look like is normal people um, that are, functioning on a day-to-day basis in many cases, but are also functionally starving. That you meet them and you talk to them, and they might offer you, a glass of water and invite you into their homes as they did me. But at the same time, they haven't eaten in a day or two, and they don't know where their next meal will come from. Starvation looks like me meeting 15-year-old boys and being confused about their age because they were literally the size of my 10-year-old daughter. They were so malnourished that they hadn't grown properly, right? So, when you do that, particularly in early childhood, one of the things that you see is cognitive decline because your brain is kind of a gas hog, right? It requires a tremendous amount of energy. If brains were cars, we're talking about it being, an F-250. It requires a tremendous amount of fuel. And when you don't have that fuel in the form of proper nutrition, particularly in the first 5 years of life, your brain doesn't form right. And so you see also a generation and a class of people who have been put in a position where they're never going to be able to achieve their greatest because of these hardships, right? So it is a big serious issue. You'll also notice that in the United States there, we grew compared to our last map on poverty. The reason for that is of all the developed nations, the United States has the highest rate of HIV/AIDS. Now again, Eswatini has the highest in all countries, but in terms of developed nations, nations that have money basically, and infrastructure and all of that, we have the highest rate of HIV/AIDS. Part of the reason why is because of this frankly stupid idea that we've had for many generations now, or for many years now, excuse me, about abstinence only education. Throughout the early 2000s, there was federal law that said that if you wanted federal money for sex education in school, it has to be abstinence only. And abstinence only education means that we're not going to teach you about condoms. We're not going to teach you about birth control. The only thing that we're going to teach you is don't have sex. Many of you probably had something like this, right? Don't have sex. The best way to not get HIV is just don't have sex. Well, to surprise no one, telling young hormonal people in their teens don't have sex doesn't work because they want to. And they don't listen and they have sex anyway. And so they're not equipped with the tools to know how to have sex safely. And so this is why you see such a high rate of sexually transmitted infections in the United States, including HIV/AIDS. We've been able to look at state by state data as well. And one of the things that we find is that the states that pass laws saying young people have to have comprehensive sex education, which means that we're going to tell you about birth control, we're going to tell you about condoms, we're going to tell you about sexually transmitted diseases. They have drastically lower rates of HIV/AIDS. They have drastically lower rates of teen pregnancy. States that say, nope, we're only going to do abstinence education, we're going to round up all the teenagers and put them in the gym and tell them just don't have sex. They have way higher rates of STDs. They have way higher rates of HIV. They have way higher rates of teen pregnancy, right? So this is a thing that just doesn't work, right? And unfortunately, for many many years too, the United States is the primary distributor of international aid in the world, and because we said, you can only have absence only education at home, we said the same thing abroad, and so many of these countries, they were told simply, don't have sex and you can fix AIDS. And again, people are people and sex is fun. And so they didn't listen to that. And the consequence of it, you see on this map right here. The consequence of it is exactly what I was talking about, with a generation that is now dead and a generation below them that is now starving, right? So, moving on a little bit, but similarly related, what I was talking about was the percentage of the population that is undernourished. You can see on this map that sub-Saharan Africa is drastically higher than most parts of the world. Just to let you know, the sort of tan, white or tan areas, depending on how this looks on your screen, is no data. It's not that there is, it's great in many of these places, but it's just that we don't have data on it. And so, again, all of this becomes linked, right? The history, the colonialism, the marginalization of these social groups by others, excuse me, the conquest of one group by the other. It leads into these things. Our policies about teaching people to not teaching people how to protect themselves when they decide to have sex. It leads to all of this. All of this becomes interconnected, and this undernourishment, this malnourishment with these groups, then feeds back into that poverty and creates this cycle, right? One of the other things that I want to say is about conservation, right? So the term biodiversity, biodiversity just refers to how diverse the species are in certain places. And so maybe you're sitting there thinking, I don't care about this, whatever. Maybe you don't care about people, whatever. I know that's a callous statement, but what I want you to understand here is that, again, everything is interconnected. As I keep stressing in this class, as I keep talking about with anthropology, everything is interconnected. The areas where you see a lot of biodiversity are also areas that have a tremendous amount of poverty for various complex reasons. But one of the problems with this is that when you see this rich biodiversity, these plethora of species, when people are living in poverty, they don't have the opportunity to care about biodiversity because it's a pretty straightforward thing. I'm a dad, and if my daughters were starving, I'd club a bald eagle. You know what I mean? Like, I mean, you all would. If any of you have children, you know that. Like, you know, biodiversity and worrying about conservation or threatened species or endangered species, if I'm literally starving to death, if I'm literally watching my children starve to death, then I don't have the luxury of caring about that. And so all of us, I think, are saddened when we hear about rhinos being poached and, the decline of giraffes and, elephants being poached and that kind of stuff. Many times, these are not evil, sinister people as they have been portrayed in the West, as they've been portrayed in movies and things like that. Many times, these are villagers that are starving to death, and somebody comes in and says, "Hey, I'll give you $100 for elephant tusks, or I'll give you $100 for a gorilla skull or a chimpanzee or stuff." Well, $100 is going to buy my kids food for maybe months. Am I going to shoot that elephant? Yeah, I'm going to, right? It's easy for you and I sitting in the West with food and electricity and homes and opportunity and community colleges and scholarships and everything to say, oh, well, those people shouldn't do that. Well, those people don't have what we have. And so, if we want to get serious about conservation, if we want to get serious about not seeing rhinos go extinct or whatever, then we need to get serious about poverty alleviation. We need to get serious about addressing this incredible inequality, globally speaking, or else these areas are going to get wiped out because, of course, they will, right? And so these green circles that you see on the map are biodiversity hotspots. And if you remember, many of these areas are also those areas on these other maps where people are poor, where they are starving, where they're malnourished, those kinds of things, right? Where there's high rates of HIV/AIDS. And again, HIV/AIDS is just an example. We're talking about lots and lots of different communicable diseases there, right? Um, Another thing that I want to say here too is maybe you don't care about any of that. Well, to make it super personal, as I've mentioned before, I think most of the medicines that you've ever taken, the vast majority of medicines that you've ever taken, have come from plants that we found um, that treat those diseases, right? That serve as a medicine, and we've done that because of these areas that have an incredible amount of biodiversity, where there's lots and lots of different plants that have come up with different chemicals in the evolutionary process to survive and thrive and that kind of stuff. Especially when there's lots and lots of other plants that are competing for the same resources of soil and nutrients and water and sunlight, right? So these biodiverse areas that we're looking at here are not just biodiversity and worthy of conservation for strictly philosophical reasons, but these are also the areas that we are looking at and have been looking at for many years as potential sources of medicine. Many ethnobotanists say that it is not a question of if there is a cure for cancer. Many say that it's a question of if we can find that cure, if we can find that chemical compound in a plant before the thing is pushed into extinction. And so, do we want to have a medicine that could, fight? Again, the best cancer fighting drug that we have today comes from the bark of a tree. And so, we're trying to find the next bark that's even better, right? And those kinds of things, right? And so this matters to you and I, even if we aren't living in these areas, right? This is something that is global. Again, globalization is about more than Amazon, right? It's about how the impact, or excuse me, the actions of a few can impact everyone. So rather than a map, here's an image, right? On the same line here, this is the border between Haiti and the Dominican Republic. You may not know this, but Haiti and the Dominican Republic are two countries, but they share an island called Hispaniola, right? Now, for lots of reasons, Haiti is much more impoverished than the Dominican Republic. I talk about this in another lecture, but the short version of it is because Haiti was a colony and it was a place where many enslaved Africans were taken, they ultimately were the first country and the only Western country that ever had a successful slave revolt. The slaves revolted against the people that owned them, terrorized them, beat them, raped them, murdered them. They revolted and they won. In this case, it was the French. They won, and this happened in 1804. And they liberated themselves, which is something that I think in the 21st century we can celebrate. We can say, wow, good for you, Haiti. That's a powerful statement. Unfortunately, in 1804 in the United States, we still owned slaves. And so we were quite terrified that Haiti did this, that the Haitian slaves revolted and killed all the white people and, said you can't murder us anymore and you can't rape us anymore and you can't own us anymore. Unfortunately, in 1804, we went, oh God, what if our slaves did that? And so in the United States, we really demonized Haiti. We started a lot of rumors about Haiti. We said that they were devil worshippers and baby eaters and all of this kind of stuff, right? And even today, I find that many students, I say Haiti and they think voodoo. Well, guess what? Something like 95% of Haitians are actually Catholic, okay? Voodoo is absolutely still practiced there, but it's not what you think it is, okay? As I've mentioned in other lectures. Well, because of this, people didn't go to Haiti like they did other parts of the Caribbean. And the truth is, every single Caribbean island that I know of, their number one source of revenue and GDP is tourism, right? It is people like me and you paying lots and lots of money and putting money into their economy and their tax revenue so that we can lay on the beach and drink Mai Tais and soak up the sun for a week and try to forget all of our woes, right? Well, because of this demonization of Haiti and cultural practices like voodoo, and their history of, revolting against brutal colonizers, we never really went there. The consequence of which is that Haiti is the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. And because of that poverty, right, people have had to, you know, overexploit their resources for to get by. And so you can see this on this map here of or excuse me, this photograph here, this aerial photograph. The Dominican Republic, with a lot more money, has a lot more forest, and Haiti on the left there has a lot less. Why? Well, people were so poor that they're still using firewood for cooking and heating their homes, and those kinds of things. They're still having to cut down trees just to make their homes and stuff like that, right? Again, what I'm trying to emphasize here is that conservation, environmental protection, those kinds of things are often a luxury that you get with better income, right? And so things that happened more than 200 years ago are still playing out for this country. Okay. This is another example of it with forest cover in Madagascar. Many of you probably know Madagascar from the animated movies, but Madagascar is a really unique place in terms of biodiversity. Madagascar has so many species that are found nowhere else on Earth, such as some of the lemurs that you might have seen in that animated film. There's so many animals there that we just do not see anywhere else because it's an island, because they were separated from other regions. So the evolutionary processes that took place here were pretty unique, right? And so I know this map's a little confusing, but basically those dark green areas are where there is a lot of forest and low poverty. Well, there's not many of those, right? Those tan areas are areas where there is little forest and high poverty, because those things are obviously interconnected, right? So richer regions, wealthier regions, regions that have more money are able to conserve the forest and therefore habitat for those animals, right? And areas that are in poverty, they just don't have that option. So it's also, we can talk about poverty and how it relates to health. So this is a chart that shows wealth basically is measured by GDP per capita, right? And the other axis there shows health. And what we're using as a rubric for health is basically whether or not an infant survives, right? Because what we find is that's a pretty good measure of the health quality and health standards of a country, because we typically put a lot of resources into babies because they're cute and all of that, and they're the next generation and all. And so, infant mortality, or in this case, infant survivability, low versus high, there is a pretty good sort of ruler to measure the health of a nation by. And you can see a pretty clear trajectory here, can't you? Of how much money you have and whether or not children survive, the health of a country, right? And so whether or not kids live, whether or not a population is well fed, all of those kinds of things all become interconnected here. I'll also point out that you can see that there's a pretty clear line that's going up, and then it does kind of dip at the end. That is the United States, the big green ball at the very end of the line. But you'll notice that it kind of levels off and even drops a little bit if you look at the center of our circle there. The reason for that is because of health inequality in the United States. The truth is, while we have an incredible healthcare system, we have great doctors and great technology and great treatments and all of that kind of stuff. There's also a lot of our population that we kind of ignore. So, for example, African Americans have much higher infant mortality than white Americans. Native Americans have much higher infant mortality. than white Americans, those kinds of things. Poor people have many more health problems than rich people do. It has been found that if you want to look at morbidity and mortality, so mortality is death, but morbidity is like how often you get sick, how long you're sick, those kinds of things. The number one predictor of morbidity and mortality, how long you live, how much you get sick, it's not genetics, it's money, right? It is if you are rich, you will not get sick as much. If you are poor, you will. If you are rich, you will live longer. If you are poor, you will die sooner in the United States, period, right? And so we have really ignored this as a problem for many, many years. We talk about health as a strictly biological process instead of understanding that health is also related to cultural ideas, cultural opportunity, education levels, earning potential, all of that kind of stuff. And so, since we have ignored that, it has actually brought us down on this health index quite a bit here, right? So there's kind of some interesting things here. Yeah. So let's talk about agricultural production and poverty, right? One of the sad things that I want to point out is that unfortunately we have really devalued agricultural work in the world. That in the West, we have been very, very fortunate in the United States that more and more of us, many of us, are working in other kinds of economies. Less than 2% of the population in the United States is directly involved in the food getting processed, right? And we have really outsourced a lot of our agricultural production, but at the same time, we've outsourced a lot of our poverty. And so the very people, so this shows the percent of the GDP that is based on agriculture. As you can see, it's in many developing regions. Um, Many times when we've outsourced that agriculture, we've outsourced the poverty of it because we are, just going and buying the cheapest bananas we can. We're buying the cheapest strawberries we can. We're buying the cheapest chicken that we can. But unfortunately, buying as cheap as possible means that somewhere down the line, there's got to be money cut. And unfortunately, that's usually uh, the makers of that food, the producers of that food that we are eating. And so we are really expecting people that are keeping us alive to shoulder the burden of cheap prices, right, and cheap commodities. And so it's really something I think that we need to think about. We're starting to have more conversations of that. I am able to feed my kids because some other dad somewhere can't, right? And you can see the red and the yellow boxes here about the percentage of the population that is living on $1 a day or less, right? And so it's a very, very tragic thing, and I think that it is something that, again, as a globalized species at this point, we need to have the conversation that um, it's not just about production and earning and things like that in my backyard or in my neighbor's yard or whatever in my country. We're all interconnected with this. And me demanding really, really cheap burgers means that somebody else will never be able to afford that. Okay. So, again, that holistic perspective on this. The same thing is true of shelter and sanitation, right? So this is, I know it's a little bit of a confusing map, but these are the big blue circles are refugee camps, right? And the black dots are cities that exceed 750,000 people. Now, the reason that and the shading of the map represents whether or not people have improved access to sanitation, meaning, properly flushing toilets and things like that, and not open pit latrines and stuff. The reason that I'm showing you this is that, again, something that happens to one of us affects all of us, as has been demonstrated over the last several decades. We're a globalized society. We cannot stop the flow of people and goods and services. We need them, right? As I was just showing you, much of our food is grown in other parts of the world. And so we can't close borders. We can't cut off travel. We absolutely need this. Our world is built on it. Our food is built on it. Our livelihoods are built on it, right? And so materially, whatever your philosophy is about immigration and things like that, it literally can't stop or we'd all starve, okay? And so, since people are flowing and goods are flowing and services are flowing literally around the globe with globalization, that means that what happens in some far corner of the world will quite literally impact everyone. This was demonstrated with COVID, right? This was demonstrated with Ebola. This was demonstrated with swine flu. This was demonstrated with bird flu. This on and on and on and on. And so, yeah, COVID is and was the big one. But that wasn't new and that wasn't surprising. It's why we had been talking about this for so long, because all of this is going to impact us, right? And so, having people that are displaced, living in refugee camps, it's not just a moral need. It's not just a philosophical need to treat those human beings better. There is also the reality that having people live in squalor means that you're going to breed disease. You're going to breed illness. You're going to, have really bad things coming out of those areas, and it will absolutely make its way to your neighborhood. So again, we are all in this together, and we need to maybe rethink how we do. Another thing is gender, right? When we look at gender and education, unfortunately, around the globe, we find that being born female in some places means that you are never going to have the opportunities that you would have had if you were born male. Okay. And so, what this map is measuring is the number of girls per boys that are in primary education, meaning, school, what we would call, public school, basically. And, this is a tremendous loss of potential. Again, women make up actually a little bit better than half the world. And so, when we talk about taking half the population and not educating them, that means that we are losing out on half of the ideas, half of the innovation, half of everything, right? That can come, the creative potential, from art to music to technology to mathematics to whatever, right? And so this is a big problem, and it's again, as I mentioned at the beginning of this, it's about a genetic lottery of where you were born. My daughters will have all opportunities laid out for them in terms of primary education and reading and school and college, and they have the opportunity to achieve their greatest potential. And unfortunately, that's not true for daughters around the globe. And again, we're all the losers because of it. Now, I want to mention here at the closing is that, oftentimes we focus on other places and their problems. Anthropology is something that can happen in our own backyards. And so I want to talk about poverty in the United States, right? From the 2000s, really, there was a massive increase in poverty in the United States in many, many places, right? Many states saw an increase of 5 or 6%. Some states saw it anywhere up to 9%, right? And so poverty and inequality and the loss that that causes in terms of health and nutrition and sanitation and education and opportunity and conservation and the rest of this is also happening in those states where we see poverty rise, right? So again, my point in this is all of it becomes interconnected. And it is in our own backyard, right? And so it's a conversation that we need to have more often, to talk about these impacts and how they are all interconnected with one another, and some of these downsides of globalization, right? In the form of inequality. Okay. All right. Well, thank you all very much, and I will see you next time.